Hello, I'm your instructor, Mr. Norcott-Mahany, and I'm going to give you sort of 5 or 6 things that I think you need to know or should know before you start looking at the Theogony. First of all, this is chapter 2. The reading from the Greek is Hesiod's Theogony. If you don't have the book, you can find it in module number 1. It says Hesiod's Theogony with commentary. If you go through chapter 2, you'll see it near the bottom, and that's the entire text of the Theogony. So that will help you get through the material for the beginning of chapter 2. So first of all, Hesiod, the author of the Theogony, the person whom we call the author of the Theogony. Now, one of the problems with the designation is that Hesiod was an oral poet. So he wrote, well, he didn't write anything. He composed poems in performance based on sort of templates and stories. So he would have story ideas in his mind, and he'd have pieces of templates, a verse that would go together, and that would form the poem in performance, and that would allow him to mix things up. So he might go longer on a particular thing or shorter on a particular thing, depending on the audience he was performing for. Now, he lived in the 8th century, the 700s BCE. He probably lived in Boeotia, which is in north central Greece. If you look on the map, you can find Boeotia. The city of Thebes is the main city in Boeotia. Delphi is also in Boeotia. So it's an important sort of area of Greece, and there are a lot of myths that are set there. Hesiod, in the 2 works that are attributed to him, tells us about himself. The problem is, and these works, by the way, are called the Theogony and the Works and Days. The problem with Hesiod talking about himself and giving us information is that we have no guarantee that in fact is true. In the Theogony, which is a poem about the creation and about the rise of Zeus as the chief god, those are the 2 main sort of story arcs in the work. There's a scene where Hesiod says the Muses appeared to him while he was tending sheep on Mount Helicon, which is a mountain in Boeotia, and it is a mountain that's associated with the Muses. The Muses are the inspirational goddesses for creative things. Later, they get to be attributed to certain things. So Clio is the muse of history. Polyhymnia is the muse of sort of choral poetry, and so for Calliope is the muse of epic poetry. Hesiod would, I think, have known none of those. The muses were a group of 9 who were inspiration to the oral poet. Because if you're an oral poet, the key thing is, when you're in performance, you can't blow it. You can't, you're like, oh, where do I go next? You can't stop for a moment. There can't be hems and haws like I'm sort of doing. It has to go straight through. It has to fit a certain metrical pattern. It has to have a beat. There'd be musical accompaniment. All of that stuff has to come together in performance. So the closest modern thing I can think of would be, if we think of like, some people who do freestyle rap, that would be like an equivalent thing. They've got a form, they know roughly what they need to do and the message they're trying to do, but then in the actual performance, they're sort of creating it partly. So it's somewhat improvisation. But the point is, you can't stop. I mean, if you start hemming and hawing and messing up, then you're not going to be an oral poet for long. Now, we know that sometime in the 8th century BCE, literacy came to Greece. What the Greeks did is they took a syllabary. This means every symbol represents a syllable. So, for instance, there'd be like a ba, a bi, a boo, right? So there'd be different symbols for syllables, not just individual letters. That the Phoenicians had, they took that syllabary and made it into, as far as I know, the first true alphabet in the world. Here, where there are symbols for vowel sounds like ah, and symbols for consonant sounds like ga or ta or da. So that's actually radical. I mean, it doesn't sound radical to us because we're used to seeing an alphabet. But if there had not been an alphabet before and the writing systems were either pictographic like Egyptian or they were syllabaries, then that's a radical idea. That we're going to take some of these symbols from Phoenician that represent consonant sounds and we're going to make them vowel sounds. That's sort of a radical idea. So, and it does allow for a certain flexibility in Greek literature that you didn't see in some of the other literature that was going on in the Middle East, in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's an important deal. That happens probably sometime in Hesiod's life, but Hesiod himself would not know how to write. Writing as a new technology and the alphabet as a new system of writing, it would take time for the society to get used to that, where they can actually write things down and copy things and the like. So we don't know when Hesiod's works were actually set down in writing. We know that in Hesiod's lifetime, they probably were not. So the works that we have are the Theogony and the Works and Days. So the Theogony is the poem that you're going to read. It's in a prose translation. It's a good translation, but it's in prose. The Theogony literally means birth of the gods. It's the creation story followed by the rise of Zeus. And the key message, I think, at the end of the poem is that Zeus is in charge and Zeus is too smart to be toppled, unlike his father, whom Zeus toppled, and his grandfather, whom Zeus's father toppled. So there had been this dynastic battle. It's ended with Zeus, but now that's over. The dust is cleared, and Zeus is now in charge forever, right? That's sort of the message. The other work, the Works and Days, was a work really of sort of like rules and regulations. It's like there are a lot of proverbial things in it, and also of farming advice. So it's sort of like a farmer's almanac in verse. There's lots of strange things in it. Now, in that poem, The Works and Days, Hesiod says that he was a farmer from a town called Askra. Well, he may have been from Askra, that we don't know. It is unlikely he was either a farmer or a shepherd. And by the way, those are not like mutually, like you would not be both. You would be a shepherd or you'd be a farmer. So he's either one or the other, or he's neither. And I think he's probably neither, because to actually become an oral poet, it would take years for you to learn how to do that. So you'd really start as a kid, where you'd be basically like the equipment guy for the singer, and then gradually you're picking up his songs, and then you're building some of your own repertoire over time. That pretty much means, like, as an adult, you've known no other job other than singer. You weren't doing something else. So it's unlikely that Hesiod was a shepherd as an adult whom the Muses appeared to and got his powers. But that fits the story that's talking about the creation, because he says the Muses themselves told him that. So it gives them sort of divine inspiration for that story, which no human could really know. In The Works and Days, he's basically writing an advice book to his brother Perses, according to the poem, who had cheated him out of the family farm. And so it's really a poem about how to do a farm and what does it mean to be a just person. And what better way to set that up than to say, I'm the guy who should have had the family farm. I'm the guy who should be running it, and here's my advice. So he's basically giving himself farming cred for that poem. And so I don't think in either case, he is what he says he was, a farmer or a shepherd. All right. A couple of other things about Hesiod's time. So Hesiod, as I said, lived in the 8th century BCE, so the 700s. He would be coming out of, or Greece would have been coming out of, a period called the Dark Ages. So many of you know the stories of Hercules. Many of you know the story of the Trojan War, or know bits and pieces of that. Those events happen roughly in like 1300 BCE, around 1200 BCE. That's the sort of time frame. At that period, the late Bronze Age, a period sometimes called the Mycenaean Age, there was great material prosperity. There was a great city center at Mycenae and some other places like Thebes and Pylos. But something happened in Greece sometime between 1200 and 1100 BCE. Now, around 1200 is when the Trojan War is supposed to have happened, and there were myths that said that the Greek civilization collapsed following the Trojan War. It didn't happen right away, but it took place over a period of years, and there were a series of invasions. That bit about, those invasions, we don't know how accurate that is, but there seems to have been a collapse. And if there really was a Trojan War, there may very well have been a collapse, because you would have had people out fighting away from home, and then that would have given the opportunity for the home situation to basically start to crumble, so that when the leaders came back, things were really messed up, and that would eventually sort of implode on itself. At any rate, during the Dark Ages, from about 1100 to around 800 BCE, Greece is dirt poor. There are no city centers. People live in small villages. There's no real strong power structure. You have like local chieftains. So it's really sort of a depressed, messed up sort of world, which may be why the myths all talk about the time before that happens, right? They talk about Hercules and they talk about the Trojan War, because those were the good days, right? And then there was a 300-year period of material dearth, and then out of that, starting around 800, Greece starts to engage in trade with Phoenicia, with the Middle East, with Egypt, and they start to pick up things from those cultures, and they also start to pick up material goods, and things start to get to be better. And it's in that context that Hesiod would have lived. So things are starting to get better. They're not better yet. Hesiod tends to be a sort of pessimistic author, which sort of fits with that. He basically is living in like a really long depression. It's at the end of it, but they're not out of it yet. So a couple of other things that I want to talk about, and I'm going to be sort of quick about that. One is the way the Greeks viewed the world. So this is a sort of diagram. So Earth was imagined to be a flat disk, and around that flat disk was the river Ocean. Above it, as a dome, as an actual dome, like in under the dome, was the sky. So the sky is seen as a solid mass that is a dome on top of the Earth, and Tartarus, the underworld, is like a bowl under the Earth. So imagine sort of sphere cut in half by the disk that is the Earth. Now, the reason that's sort of important, when you read the story of the castration of Uranos, which is one of the stories that you'll encounter in the Theogony, imagine sky, Uranos, on top of Earth, Gaia, as flat plains, as both of them being flat plains. If they're flat and they're engaged in sexual activity, then the two of them cannot separate from one another, and no one can be born. And in the Egyptian account, the Egyptians have a similar account. In the Egyptian account, it's purely a practical matter. They castrate the male figure so that sky pops up as a dome, and now people can walk on the Earth. Now, when you read the Theogony account, it is not set up that way at all, but that seems to be what's behind it. Why the castration of Sky? The original idea that the Egyptians have seems to be to separate Sky from Earth so that Sky pops up as a dome above the Earth. And Hesiod will not say anything like that. His thing is this big family drama, and the castration is not meant as a practical solution. It's basically meant as revenge. Mom doesn't like Dad anymore, and she arranges to have him taken care of. I mean, is what happens. So, three stories to focus on when you read the Theogony. One is the story of Ouranos and Gaia, which ends in the castration of Ouranos. The next is the birth of Aphrodite, which follows directly on the castration, because his scrotal sac, which is severed, is tossed into the sea, and out of the scrotal sac on the sea forms Aphrodite. So, according to Hesiod. And then the story of Prometheus and how he tricked Zeus, and then how Pandora, or the first woman, was created as a punishment for human beings to offset the gift of fire that Prometheus gave them. So those are the sort of stories to like really focus on. What you're also going to see in the account is the first like 200 lines is a long hymn to the Muses. Talks about the Muses a lot, so you'll get a lot of stuff on them. It's basically a praise poem. Later, there's a praise poem to a goddess named Hecate. Why she gets a special thing is I honestly don't know, but that's in there. And then there are a lot of catalogs, and these catalogs are just like lists. So the daughters of ocean, there are 50 daughters of ocean, and they're all named. Now, to us, that may seem boring, and when you're reading it, you're going to say, well, there's like a lot of names. Am I supposed to remember any of these? No, you're not supposed to remember all those. I don't remember them all. I know some of them. But what the catalog would allow a poet to do is show his stuff to an audience. Because unlike the prefab parts of oral poetry, where you've got like set phrases, so when dawn with her rosy fingers arose, right, would be like a set line that every time you have dawn, you can use that line. So you don't have to remember. You got a line, it's going to fit, everything's metrically going to work. You don't have to worry about blowing the line. You get it set. You can't really do that with a catalog. Catalog's a whole list of names, and it doesn't really allow for a lot of variation. And so if you skip a name or somehow get tripped up on a name and forget it, then your whole catalog is going to collapse. And so I think the catalogs for the ancient poet and his audience, they were showstoppers. They were basically, how long can this guy do it? I mean, that 50-name catalog, that's like a good 5 minutes of him basically just rattling off names. Like, can he do it for 5? Can he do it for 6? Can he do it for 7? I mean, that seems to be part of the whole thing for catalogs for the ancients. For us, it doesn't quite come across that way, partly because we're reading in the prose translation. So I think that's enough for you to think about as you're reading the Hesiod's Theogony. If you have the book, read chapter 2, the first part that gives you some background, and the Theogony itself. If you don't have that, then look definitely at the Theogony that's in the modules. That way you can at least get that under your belt. You can make your discussion posts. So I will be back next week to talk about some other stuff dealing with the rest of chapter 2.